Nobody expected Marcus Rivera to uncover the greatest automotive treasure in American history, hidden beneath decades of rust and ridicule in what everyone called the most worthless garage in Millfield County. When the dust settled in the barn, doors finally opened, revealing row after row of pristine muscle cars worth over $200 million. The same neighbors who had mocked him for inheriting Uncle Eddie's junkyard would stand speechless as auction houses from around the world descended upon the forgotten collection. This is the story of a combat veteran turned small-town mechanic whose inheritance of scrap metal and broken dreams became the discovery that would rewrite automotive history forever. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying this story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cracked asphalt of Rivera's auto repair, illuminating the peeling paint on the hand-lettered sign that Marcus had installed 3 months ago when he'd foolishly thought things might turn around. Now as he crouched beneath Mrs. Chen's rusted Honda Civic, trying to coax life back into a transmission that should have been scrapped years ago, the bitter irony wasn't lost on him. 6 months ago, he'd been Marcus Rivera, Staff Sergeant, United States Army, responsible for maintaining an entire motor pool of military vehicles worth millions of dollars. Today, he was just another struggling mechanic in a town that seemed to specialize in watching dreams die slowly. The wrench slipped from his oil-slicked fingers, clattering against the concrete floor as he suppressed a curse. His lower back, still carrying shrapnel fragments from that IED outside Kandahar, sent sharp reminders up his spine with every movement. The VA doctors had been clear about his limitations, though they'd been less helpful about solutions. Service-connected disability, they called it, as if giving it a name somehow made the constant ache more bearable or the sleepless nights easier to endure. "Marcus, you under there?" Mrs. Chen's voice carried a note of worried impatience that had become all too familiar in recent weeks. She was one of the few customers who still brought her car to him, more out of pity than confidence, he suspected. "Almost done, Mrs. Chen," he called out, though they both knew he was lying. The transmission needed a complete rebuild, something that would cost more than the 15-year-old Civic was worth. But Mrs. Chen couldn't afford a new car, and Marcus couldn't afford to turn away any paying customer, no matter how small the profit margin. He slid out from under the car, wiping his hands on a rag that had long since given up any pretense of cleanliness. Mrs. Chen stood in the doorway of the garage bay, her expression caught between hope and resignation. Behind her, Marcus could see the gleaming facade of Precision Auto across the street, where Tony Calabrese's team of certified technicians worked in spotless uniforms under fluorescent lights that actually illuminated their work bays properly. "I'm afraid it's going to need more work than we hoped," Marcus said, hating the words even as he spoke them. "The transmission's shot. I can patch it temporarily, but it won't last more than a few weeks." Mrs. Chen's shoulders sagged. "How much? For the patch job?" $50. "For a proper rebuild, we're looking at 800, maybe 1,000 with parts." She was quiet for a long moment, staring at the car that represented her lifeline to her job at the textile plant 20 miles away. Marcus knew the math as well as she did. $800 might as well have been $8 million for someone living paycheck to paycheck in Millfield. "Do the patch," she said finally. "Maybe. It'll last until I can save up some money." As Marcus returned to work beneath the Honda, he tried to ignore the laughter drifting across the street from Precision Auto. Tony Calabrese and his crew made no secret of their amusement at his situation. Rivera's junkyard, they called it. Though never to his face, they were too smart for that. Marcus might be struggling financially, but 10 years in the Army had left him with skills that went beyond automotive repair. The laughter grew louder, and Marcus caught fragments of conversation, carried on the autumn wind. Double quotes, ... can't believe he actually thought he could make a go of it. ... double quotes. double quotes, Uncle Eddie's pile of scrap metal, should have just sold the land and moved on, Uncle Eddie, Eduardo Rivera, his father's older brother, the family eccentric who had spent 40 years hoarding cars in increasingly deteriorating condition. When the lawyers had called 6 months ago to inform Marcus that he'd inherited Eddie's property, including the garage and associated automotive inventory, Marcus had driven down from Detroit with cautious optimism. Maybe this was the break he needed, a chance to start over in a place where nobody knew about the nightmares or the pills or the reasons he'd left his job at the Ford plant. That optimism had lasted exactly 30 minutes, the time it took to walk through Eddie's garage and the massive barn behind it. Rusted hulks, stripped chassis, engine seized solid with decades of neglect. The neighbors had gathered to watch his face as reality set in, their expressions ranging from sympathetic to openly amused. Eddie was always going to leave that mess. To somebody, old Bill Patterson had chuckled. "Guess you drew the short straw, son." The joke had spread through Millfield like wildfire. Marcus Rivera, the sucker who inherited a junkyard and thought he could turn it into a real business. The few customers who did venture into his garage came with the attitude of people doing charity work, bringing him their most hopeless cases. Because, as one farmer had put it, can't make 'em any worse, right? Marcus finished patching Mrs. Chen's transmission as the sun reached its zenith, sending waves of heat through the open bay doors. The garage had no air conditioning, and the ancient fans Eddie had installed sometime in the 1980s did little more than push the hot air around. His work shirt, a faded blue button-down with Marcus embroidered over the pocket, clung to his back with sweat and motor oil. "That should get you by for a while," he told Mrs. Chen, though they both knew a while was optimistic. She pressed $50 into his palm, the bills damp with her own nervous perspiration. "Thank you, Marcus. I know things are tough right now, but you're a good man. This town needs people like you." Her words carried more kindness than he'd heard in weeks, and Marcus felt his throat tighten unexpectedly. "Just trying to help where I can, Mrs. Chen." After she drove away, her Honda coughing ominously as it disappeared down Main Street, Marcus stood alone in his empty garage. The silence was deafening after months of hoping for the steady hum of activity that never materialized. He walked to the ancient cash register Eddie had used for decades, its brass keys worn smooth by countless transactions. The day's take, $50. Enough to buy groceries for 3 days if he was careful. The mortgage payment on the property was due in 2 weeks. $1,200 that might as well have been $12 million. Marcus had already sold everything of value he owned, including his truck, making do now with Eddie's ancient Ford pickup that leaked oil and started only when the weather gods smiled upon it. The VA disability check covered his basic needs, barely, but it wasn't enough to sustain a business that required constant investment in tools, parts, and equipment. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts, pausing at numbers he'd been avoiding for weeks. Tom Bradley, his old supervisor at Ford, had left 3 voicemails about positions opening up on the line. Good jobs, union jobs, the kind of steady work that would solve his immediate financial problems. All he had to do was admit defeat, sell Eddie's property for whatever he could get, and return to Detroit with his tail between his legs. The thought of facing his former co-workers, of explaining why his grand plan had failed so spectacularly, made his stomach churn. But pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. Marcus was reaching for his phone when he heard the distinctive rumble of a muscle car engine approaching. He looked up to see a pristine 1969 Dodge Charger RT pulling into his driveway, its Hemi V8 purring with the kind of precision that spoke of meticulous maintenance and unlimited resources. The car was painted in factory-correct B5 blue with white racing stripes, its chrome bumpers reflecting the afternoon sun like mirrors. The driver's door opened, and out stepped a man who looked like he'd walked off the pages of a classic car magazine. Late 50s, silver hair perfectly styled, wearing a polo shirt that probably cost more than Marcus made in a week. Everything about him screamed money and success, from his spotless white sneakers to the gold Rolex catching the light on his wrist. "Marcus Rivera?" the man called out, his voice carrying the confidence of someone accustomed to being heard and obeyed. "That's me," Marcus replied, suddenly conscious of his grimy appearance and the stark contrast between this visitor and his usual clientele. The man approached with an extended hand and a practiced smile. "Richard Blackwood, Blackwood Classic Auto. I've driven down from Chicago specifically to see you." Marcus accepted the handshake, noting the soft palm that had never held a wrench in anger. "Chicago's a long way to come for automotive repair, Mr. Blackwood. I think you might have me confused with someone else." Blackwood's laugh was polished and slightly condescending. "Oh, I'm not here for repairs, Mr. Rivera. I'm here about your uncle's collection." The word collection hung in the air like a bad joke. Marcus gestured toward the visible portion of Eddie's accumulated automotive disasters. "I'm not sure what you've heard, but there's no collection here. Just a lot of scrap metal that's been sitting too long." "Yes, I can see that," Blackwood said, his gaze taking in the rusted hulks with obvious disdain. "But I'm more interested in what might be stored in that barn behind the garage. The one that's been locked up for, 30 years or so." Marcus felt a flicker of something he couldn't quite identify. Interest? Hope? More likely just curiosity about why this obviously wealthy man had driven 3 hours to look at junk. "The barn's just storage," Marcus said carefully. "Farm equipment, old parts, things like that. Nothing that would interest a classic car dealer." Blackwood's smile widened, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Rivera, your Uncle Eddie and I had several conversations over the years. He was quite secretive about what he kept in that barn, but he let slip enough details to intrigue me. I'm prepared to make you a very generous offer for whatever's in there, sight unseen." "How generous?" Marcus found himself asking, though he immediately regretted showing interest. $50,000, Blackwood said without hesitation. "Cash, today, for everything in the barn. No questions asked, no inspections required. Just sign the papers and walk away with enough money to start fresh somewhere else." The offer hit Marcus like a physical blow. $50,000 would solve every immediate problem he faced. Pay off the mortgage, settle his debts maybe. Even have enough left over to relocate and start over properly. All for whatever junk Eddie had been hoarding in a barn that Marcus had never even bothered to explore thoroughly. "That's a very generous offer," Marcus said slowly, his mind racing through the implications. "But I'd need to know what I'm selling before I agree to anything." Blackwood's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "Mr. Rivera, I'm offering you a way out of what is clearly a difficult situation. Sometimes it's better not to ask too many questions." The comment stung because it was accurate. Marcus was drowning financially, and everyone in Millfield knew it. But something in Blackwood's eagerness, in his obvious desire to avoid actually seeing what he was buying, triggered a warning signal that Marcus had learned to trust during his military service. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Blackwood, but I'll need some time to think about it." The dealer's smile became strained. "Time is a luxury you may not have, Mr. Rivera. I've done my research on your financial situation. This offer won't be available indefinitely." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Marcus felt his jaw tighten as old instincts kicked in. He'd faced down insurgents in Afghanistan who'd tried to intimidate him with far more direct methods than Richard Blackwood's polished corporate menace. "Then I guess I'd better make my decision carefully," Marcus replied, his voice carrying a calm that belied the anger building in his chest. Blackwood studied him for a moment, then shrugged with practiced indifference. "Your choice, of course. But opportunities like this don't come along often in places like Millfield." He reached into his pocket and produced an expensive business card. Call me when you're ready to be reasonable." As the Charger rumbled away, Marcus stood holding the business card and wondering what exactly he'd just turned down. $50,000 was more money than he'd ever held at one time. Certainly more than anything in Eddie's barn could possibly be worth. But Blackwood's eagerness, his reluctance to actually inspect the merchandise, had triggered every suspicious instinct Marcus possessed. For the first time since inheriting the property, Marcus found himself genuinely curious about what Uncle Eddie had been hiding in that locked barn for the past 3 decades. The rest of that afternoon passed in restless contemplation as Marcus tried to focus on routine maintenance tasks while Blackwood's offer echoed in his mind. $50,000 for contents unseen suggested either incredible generosity or knowledge of something valuable that Marcus himself didn't possess. Neither explanation sat comfortably with him, particularly given the dealer's obvious reluctance to actually examine what he was so eager to purchase. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, casting longer shadows across the garage floor, Marcus heard the distinctive sound of another classic car approaching. This time, however, the engine note was wrong, stuttering and missing with the irregular rhythm that spoke of serious mechanical distress. A 1967 Shelby GT500 limped into his driveway, its Cobra Jet 428 engine coughing like a chain smoker in the final stages of emphysema. The driver, who emerged from the legendary muscle car, looked to be in his early 70s, with silver hair beneath a well-worn baseball cap and clothes that spoke of comfortable retirement rather than flashy wealth. His face carried the weathered lines of someone who had spent decades working with his hands, and his movements as he approached Marcus suggested the careful deliberation of age rather than infirmity. "You Marcus Rivera?" the man asked, his voice carrying the flat vowels of the upper Midwest. "That's right. Sounds like your Shelby's having some serious troubles." The older man nodded grimly. "Name's Frank Kowalski. Drove down from Wisconsin to show this beauty at the classic car show in Springfield tomorrow, but she started acting up about 50 miles back. Been nursing her along ever since, barely keeping her running." Marcus walked around the GT500, his trained ear cataloging the engine's irregular firing pattern, while his eyes took in details that most people would miss. The car was a genuine Shelby, not one of the countless replicas that flooded classic car shows. The VIN tag, the distinctive hood scoop, the side exhaust outlets, everything checked out as authentic. But more importantly, this particular GT500 had been restored with a level of attention to detail that bordered on obsession. "This is a numbers-matching car," Marcus observed, running his hand along the front fender. "Original engine, transmission, rear end. Someone spent serious money and time bringing her back to factory specification." Frank's eyebrows rose slightly. "You can tell all that just from looking?" "The details tell the story," Marcus replied, popping the hood to reveal the massive 428 Cobra jet engine. Paint codes, casting numbers, date stamps. Most people restore these cars to look good at car shows, but whoever worked on this one cared about authenticity. The engine bay revealed the source of the problem immediately. The distributor cap showed signs of moisture intrusion, and several plug wires displayed the telltale crackling of electrical breakdown. But as Marcus examined the system more closely, he noticed something that made him pause. "Mr. Kowalski, this distributor isn't original to your car." Frank leaned in, squinting at the component Marcus was indicating. "What do you mean? See this part number?" Marcus pointed to the barely visible stamping on the distributor housing. "This is from a 1968 model year. Your car should have the earlier unit with the different advance curve. It'll run, but not the way Ford intended." Frank stared at him with obvious surprise. "How in the hell do you know that?" Marcus had asked himself the same question countless times over the years. The knowledge was just there, accumulated through decades of obsessive study and hands-on experience that had begun in his father's garage, when he was barely tall enough to see over the fender of a car. Military service had expanded his understanding of engines and mechanical systems, but his real education had come from nights spent with technical manuals and weekends hunting salvage yards and swap meets. "I've always had a thing for muscle cars," Marcus said, understating the truth by several orders of magnitude. "Spent a lot of years studying the details that matter." "Well, can you fix it?" Frank asked. "I've got reservations at the hotel in Springfield, and this car show means a lot to me. First time I've shown her since my wife passed." The comment hit Marcus unexpectedly. He recognized the look in Frank's eyes, the determination to honor someone's memory through mechanical perfection. "Let me take a closer look." For the next hour, Marcus worked on the Shelby with a precision and focus that felt almost meditative. He replaced the faulty distributor cap and plug wires, but went further, adjusting the timing and carburetor settings to optimize the engine's performance. As he worked, Frank watched with growing amazement at the depth of Marcus's knowledge. "You?" "No," Frank said as Marcus fine-tuned the idle mixture. "I've had this car to 3 different shops over the past year. Each one told me it was running fine, that the minor issues I was hearing were just part of owning a classic car. They weren't listening to what the engine was telling them," Marcus replied, making a final adjustment to the timing. "A 428 Cobra. Jet has a very specific sound when everything's properly synchronized. Most people hear an engine that starts and assume that's good enough." Marcus stepped back and nodded toward the driver's seat. "Try her now." Frank turned the key, and the transformation was immediate. The Shelby's engine settled into a smooth, powerful idle that resonated with authority. As Frank revved the engine, the sound was pure mechanical poetry, each cylinder firing with perfect timing and fuel mixture. "Jesus Christ," Frank breathed, his face lighting up with the kind of joy that comes from hearing a beloved machine perform exactly as its designers intended. "She hasn't sounded this good since the day I bought her." Marcus wiped his hands on his rag, trying to hide his own satisfaction at the work. "Take her for a drive around the block. Make sure everything feels right." Frank didn't need to be asked twice. The GT500 pulled away from the garage with a throaty rumble that turned heads, even on Millfield's quiet Main Street. Marcus watched it disappear around the corner, then noticed the small crowd that had gathered across the street at Precision Auto. Tony Calabrese and his crew stood outside their shop, clearly listening to the Shelby's engine note with expressions of surprise and grudging respect. When Frank returned 5 minutes later, his grin was wide enough to split his face. "Mister, I don't know how you did it, but this car feels like it did when I first brought her home from the restoration shop. Better, even. How much do I owe you?" Frank asked, reaching for his wallet. Marcus considered the question. The work had taken him barely an hour, and the parts were standard maintenance items. At Precision Auto, they would have charged at least $300 for similar work, probably more given the car's value and the customer's obvious attachment to it. $50 for the parts, Marcus said. No charge for the labor. Frank stared at him as if he'd spoken in a foreign language. "Son, you just solved a problem that 3 other shops couldn't figure out, and you want $50? "You're traveling to honor your wife's memory," Marcus replied quietly. "I understand what that means." Frank's expression softened, and for a moment, Marcus thought the older man might tear up. Instead, he pulled out his wallet and counted out $200. "The extra is a tip," Frank said firmly when Marcus started to protest. "And I want you to have this." He handed Marcus a business card, but not his own. The card read Jerry Patterson Barrett Jackson Auction Company with a phone number and email address. "Jerry's a friend of mine, been in the classic car business for 30 years. He's always looking for people who really understand these machines. Not just the guys who can make them look pretty. You call him and tell him Frank Kowalski sent you." As the Shelby rumbled away into the gathering dusk, Marcus stood holding the business card and the money, aware that something significant had just occurred. Word would spread about what he'd accomplished in his humble garage. Frank Kowalski would tell the story at the car show tomorrow, and car enthusiasts had a way of communicating that rivaled any modern social network. More immediately, Tony Calabrese was walking across the street, his usual smirk replaced by an expression of curiosity and calculation. "Hell of a thing you just did there, Rivera," Tony said, jerking his thumb toward the retreating taillights of the GT500. "Old Frank's been complaining about that car's performance for months. Brought it to my shop twice, and my guys couldn't find anything wrong with it." Marcus nodded but didn't respond, sensing there was more coming. "Thing is," Tony continued, "that was some pretty specialized knowledge you showed off there. Makes a man wonder what other skills you might be hiding." The comment wasn't entirely friendly, carrying undertones that Marcus recognized from his military days. Tony was recalibrating his assessment, realizing that the laughingstock mechanic he'd been mocking might represent more competition than he'd anticipated. "Just trying to help where I can," Marcus replied evenly. Tony studied him for a moment longer, then shrugged. "Well, good luck with that. But you might want to be careful about undercharging for specialized work. Gives people the wrong impression about what quality service should cost." After Tony returned to his shop, Marcus found himself alone again, with his thoughts and the increasingly mysterious question of what Uncle Eddie had left him. The day's events had reminded him of truths he'd been trying to forget. He was exceptionally good at understanding automobiles, particularly the classic American muscle cars that represented the pinnacle of automotive engineering from a bygone era. During his years in Detroit working the Ford assembly line, Marcus had been the go-to person when prototype engines developed unexpected problems. His supervisors had learned to trust his instincts about mechanical systems, even when computer diagnostics failed to identify issues that Marcus could hear in an engine's idle or feel through a steering wheel's vibration. But that expertise had felt like a burden rather than a gift when PTSD made it impossible to focus consistently. When the sounds of the factory floor triggered flashbacks to convoy operations in Afghanistan. The VA counselors had suggested finding work that utilized his mechanical skills without the high-pressure environment and rigid schedules of industrial manufacturing. Uncle Eddie's garage had seemed like the perfect solution, a chance to work at his own pace in a quiet setting where his knowledge and experience would be valued. Instead, he'd found himself trapped in a cycle of barely profitable repairs on dying vehicles, his reputation undermined by his inherited association with Eddie's decades of automotive hoarding. The irony was almost too painful to contemplate. He possessed the knowledge and skills to work on some of the most valuable automobiles ever manufactured, but lacked the credibility and resources to attract the customers who owned such machines. Frank Kowalski's GT500 had represented a glimpse of what his professional life could be under different circumstances. Working on a properly maintained classic car, solving problems that required genuine expertise rather than just parts replacement. Seeing the satisfaction on an owner's face when mechanical perfection was achieved. That was the kind of work that had originally drawn him to automotive repair, the intersection of technical knowledge and craftsmanship that transformed metal and machinery into something approaching art. As darkness settled over Millfield, Marcus walked to the barn behind his garage and stood before its locked doors. The structure was larger than it appeared from a distance, probably 40 feet by 60 feet, with a roof high enough to accommodate even the tallest vehicles. Eddie had always kept it locked, claiming it contained farm equipment and spare parts that weren't worth the trouble of organizing properly. But if that were true, why would Richard Blackwood drive 3 hours from Chicago to offer $50,000 for the contents? And why had he been so reluctant to actually examine what he was proposing to purchase? Marcus pulled out his phone and dialed the number on Jerry Patterson's business card. It rang 4 times before a gruff voice answered. "Patterson." "Mr. Patterson, this is Marcus Rivera from Millfield. Frank Kowalski suggested I call you." Rivera ... double quotes. Patterson's voice carried a note of recognition. "Frank called me about an hour ago. Said you worked some kind of magic on his GT500. Fixed problems that 3 other shops missed. I just listened to what the engine was telling me." Marcus replied. Patterson chuckled. "Son, if you understood everything that Frank told me about what you did to his car, you've got the kind of knowledge that can make you rich in this business. Question is, what are you doing stuck in some small town fixing grocery getters?" It was a fair question, one that Marcus didn't have a simple answer for. "Circumstances," he said finally. "Well, circumstances change," Patterson replied. "Frank says you've got an eye for authenticity, can spot details that most people miss. That's a rare skill in the classic car world. You ever think about getting into restoration consulting? Authentication work? The high-end collectors pay serious money for people who can tell them what's real and what's fake." The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, with Patterson explaining the various opportunities available to someone with Marcus's apparent expertise. By the time they ended the call, Marcus had been invited to attend the next Barrett-Jackson auction as Patterson's guest, with the possibility of working as a technical consultant if he proved as knowledgeable as Frank's recommendation suggested. As Marcus hung up the phone, he realized that his perspective on his situation had shifted dramatically in the span of a single afternoon. Frank Kowalski's Shelby had reminded him that he possessed skills and knowledge that were genuinely valuable, not just the ability to patch together failing vehicles with creative solutions and minimal resources. The question now was what Uncle Eddie had really left him, and whether Richard Blackwood's eager offer represented an opportunity to be seized or a warning to be heeded. The next morning arrived with the kind of crisp October clarity that made even Millfield's modest downtown look picturesque. Marcus had spent a restless night thinking about Frank Kowalski's GT500, Jerry Patterson's job offer, and most persistently, Richard Blackwood's mysterious eagerness to purchase contents unseen. By the time he opened the garage at 7 a.m., he had made a decision that surprised him with its certainty. Before he accepted or rejected any offers, he was going to find out exactly what Uncle Eddie had been hiding in that barn. The morning brought an unexpected stream of customers, word having spread overnight about the Shelby repair with the speed that characterized small-town communication networks. First came Janet Morrison with her husband's prized 1970 Plymouth Cuda, complaining of a rough idle that 3 previous mechanics had attributed to normal classic car behavior. Marcus spent 20 minutes diagnosing a vacuum leak that had been masked by an overly rich carburetor adjustment, then corrected both issues while Janet watched in fascination. "How did you know to look there?" she asked as Marcus demonstrated the smooth idle that resulted from proper fuel and air mixture. "The engine was working too hard to maintain proper combustion," Marcus explained, wiping his hands on a clean rag. "When you compensate for one problem by creating another, you usually end up with symptoms that don't make sense until you address the root cause." By noon, he had worked on a 1968 Camaro SS with timing issues, a 1969 Mustang Boss 302 with a mysterious oil leak, and a 1967 Corvette Stingray whose owner had driven 60 miles after hearing about the guy who actually knows these old engines. Each repair showcased knowledge that went far beyond basic mechanical competence, revealing an understanding of automotive engineering that impressed even the most knowledgeable car enthusiasts. Tony Calabrese appeared during Marcus's lunch break, his usual swagger replaced by something approaching respect. "Hell of a morning you've had, Rivera," he said, gesturing toward the Cuda that Janet Morrison was driving away with obvious satisfaction. "Word's getting around that you've got some kind of special touch with the muscle cars." Marcus unwrapped the sandwich he'd brought from home, noting that Tony seemed genuinely curious rather than hostile. "Just paying attention to what the engines are telling me." "Thing is," Tony continued, settling onto an upturned crate that served as makeshift seating in Marcus's sparse garage, "I've been working on cars for 25 years, and I've never seen anyone diagnose problems that fast. Makes a man wonder where you learned that kind of troubleshooting." The question hung in the air between them, carrying implications that Marcus wasn't entirely comfortable exploring. His knowledge had accumulated over decades through a combination of formal training, practical experience, and an almost obsessive study of automotive engineering principles. But the intuitive understanding that allowed him to hear problems in an engine's rhythm or feel issues through a steering wheel's feedback was something deeper, harder to explain or quantify. "Military maintenance experience," Marcus said finally, which was true enough without being complete. "Different equipment, but the principles are the same." Tony nodded slowly, but his expression suggested he wasn't entirely satisfied with the explanation. "Well, whatever you learned over there, it's sure getting people's attention around here. Might want to consider raising your prices before word spreads too far. These classic car people got money, and they're not used to getting quality work at bargain rates." After Tony left, Marcus found himself alone with thoughts that had been building all morning. Each successful repair had reinforced what Frank Kowalski's GT500 had reminded him. He possessed expertise that was genuinely valuable in the right context. The muscle car restoration and collector market represented exactly that context, a world where technical knowledge and attention to detail commanded premium prices and professional respect. But breaking into that world required more than just skill. It demanded credibility, connections, and most importantly, the kind of reputation that took years to build. Marcus was beginning to understand that Uncle Eddie's mysterious barn might represent more than just a potential source of quick cash. If it contained what Richard Blackwood seemed to think it did, it could be the key to establishing himself in a market where his knowledge would be valued rather than tolerated. The afternoon brought Dr. Eleanor Hoffman, a retired professor from the State University who drove a meticulously maintained 1969 Dodge Charger RT. Unlike his morning customers, who had come seeking repairs, Dr. Hoffman appeared to be conducting some kind of informal interview disguised as a routine maintenance visit. "I've heard interesting things about your work, Mr. Rivera," she said, watching as Marcus performed a comprehensive inspection of her Charger's engine bay. "Frank Kowalski called me from Springfield last night, quite excited about what you'd accomplished with his Shelby." Marcus continued his examination, noting that Dr. Hoffman's car was maintained to Concours-level standards. Every component showed evidence of careful attention, from the properly torqued fasteners to the correct date-coded hoses and belts. "Mr. Kowalski has beautiful car." The person who restored it understood how important authenticity is to proper performance. "That would be Eduardo Rivera," Dr. Hoffman said quietly. "Your Uncle Eddie did the restoration work on Frank's GT500, along with about 40 other cars over the past 30 years. Marcus straightened up so quickly that he nearly hit his head on the hood. "Uncle Eddie restored that Shelby?" Dr. Hoffman nodded, her eyes studying Marcus's reaction carefully. Eduardo was one of the finest restoration specialists in the Midwest, though he worked very quietly and only accepted projects that interested him personally. He had an almost supernatural understanding of how these engines were supposed to perform when they left the factory. The revelation hit Marcus like a physical blow. During his childhood visits to Eddie's garage, he had seen his uncle as something of an eccentric hoarder, a man who collected automotive detritus without any apparent system or purpose. The idea that Eddie had been a master craftsman working at the highest levels of restoration art challenged everything Marcus thought he knew about his inheritance. "I had no idea," Marcus said honestly. He never talked about restoration work. I thought he just collected old cars. Eduardo was very private about his business, Dr. Hoffman explained. He never advertised, never displayed his work at shows, never sought recognition for what he accomplished. People found him through word of mouth, usually after other restorers had failed to solve particularly difficult problems. She paused, studying Marcus with the same analytical attention he had been applying to her engine. Frank tells me you demonstrate the same intuitive understanding of these machines that your uncle possessed. The ability to hear what's wrong and know instinctively how to fix it. Marcus felt uncomfortable under her scrutiny, uncertain where this conversation was leading. I've always had a feel for engines. Yes, I can see that. Dr. Hoffman gestured toward her Charger. This car was one of Eduardo's last projects before he became ill. He spent 8 months researching the correct specifications for every component, tracking down original parts that most people would have replaced with modern equivalents. The result is a car that performs exactly as Dodge intended in 1969. As if to demonstrate her point, Dr. Hoffman started the Charger, and the engine settled into an idle that was almost too smooth to believe. The sound was pure automotive perfection, each cylinder firing with the precision of a Swiss watch. Now I understand why Frank was so excited, Marcus said, listening to the engine with newfound appreciation. This is how they're supposed to sound. Exactly. And according to Frank, you managed to achieve similar results with his GT500 using nothing more than basic tools and your understanding of how the engine should perform. That suggests you inherited more than just Eduardo's property, Mr. Rivera. The implication was clear, and Marcus found himself struggling to process its significance. If Uncle Eddie had been a master restorer rather than simply a collector, then the barn behind the garage might contain something far more valuable than Richard Blackwood's $50,000 offer suggested. Dr. Hoffman, Marcus said carefully, what do you know about the cars in Eddie's barn? Her expression became guarded, as if she were choosing her words with academic precision. I know that Eduardo was very secretive about his personal collection, separate from the restoration work he performed for clients. He mentioned it occasionally, always in vague terms, but never allowed anyone to see what he kept there. But you have some idea of what might be in there. Dr. Hoffman was quiet for a long moment, her gaze moving from Marcus to the locked barn, visible through the garage's rear entrance. Eduardo once told me that he had been saving the best examples for last, waiting until he had the time and resources to restore them properly. He said they represented the pinnacle of American automotive engineering from the muscle car era. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of another customer, a nervous-looking man in expensive suit who parked a late-model Mercedes well away from the work area. He approached with the tentative steps of someone venturing into unfamiliar territory. Excuse me, are you Marcus Rivera? He asked, his voice carrying the polished tones of professional success. That's right. What can I do for you? The man glanced at Dr. Hoffman, then back to Marcus. My name is David Chen. I'm an attorney here in town. I was hoping we could speak privately about a legal matter. Dr. Hoffman took the hint gracefully. I should be going anyway, she said, shaking Marcus's hand with surprising firmness. Thank you for the inspection, Mr. Rivera, and remember what I said about your uncle's legacy. After she drove away, Chen moved closer to Marcus, his expression serious. Mr. Rivera, I represent certain parties who are interested in acquiring your uncle's property. I understand you've received an offer for the contents of the barn, but my clients are prepared to make a substantially better proposal. Marcus felt a familiar wariness creeping over him. What kind of proposal? Complete purchase of the entire property for $200,000, cash, with a 30-day closing period. No inspections, no contingencies, no questions asked. The offer was so far beyond anything Marcus had imagined that he initially wondered if he'd misheard. $200,000 would solve every financial problem he faced and provide Enough capital to establish himself anywhere he chose. It was life-changing money, the kind of sum that represented complete freedom from his current struggles. But the same instincts that had warned him about Richard Blackwood were now screaming about David Chen's offer. Why would anyone pay $200,000 for property they hadn't inspected? What did these mysterious clients know about Uncle Eddie's barn that he didn't? "That's a very generous offer," Marcus said carefully. "But I'd need to know who your clients are and why they're interested in the property." Chen's expression tightened slightly. "My clients prefer to remain anonymous, and their reasons are their own business. What matters is that they're offering you a way out of what I understand is a difficult financial situation." The comment carried the same subtle threat that had characterized Blackwood's visit, the implication that Marcus's circumstances made him vulnerable to pressure. But something had changed since yesterday's encounter. Frank Kowalski's Shelby and Dr. Hoffman's revelations about Uncle Eddie had shifted Marcus's perspective on both his own abilities and his inheritance. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Chen, but I'm not ready to make any decisions about the property just yet." Chen studied him for a moment, clearly surprised by the response. "Mr. Rivera, I hope you understand that opportunities like this don't remain available indefinitely. Sometimes it's wise to accept a generous offer rather than risk losing everything by being too ambitious." The threat was more direct this time, and Marcus felt his military training kick in. He'd dealt with intimidation tactics before, usually from people who mistook financial desperation for weakness. "I understand perfectly," Marcus replied, his voice carrying a calm that belied the anger building beneath the surface. "And I understand that when multiple parties are competing to buy something sight unseen, it usually means that something is more valuable than they're willing to admit." Chen's facade cracked slightly, revealing frustration beneath the professional polish. "You're making a mistake, Rivera. My clients don't like to be kept waiting, and they don't make offers like this twice." After Chen drove away, Marcus stood alone in his garage, processing the day's revelations. Uncle Eddie hadn't been a hoarder at all, but a master craftsman whose work commanded respect from the most knowledgeable collectors in the region. The barn didn't contain junk, but potentially the finest examples of muscle car engineering that Eddie had been saving for his own restoration projects. And now multiple parties were competing to acquire those cars, offering sums that suggested extraordinary value while desperately trying to avoid revealing exactly what they were purchasing. For the first time since inheriting the property, Marcus felt genuine excitement about what he might discover behind those locked barn doors. But he also understood that whatever Eddie had left him was valuable enough to attract serious attention from people who weren't accustomed to taking no for an answer. As the sun set over Millfield, Marcus walked to the barn and examined its locks with new purpose. Tomorrow, he decided, he would finally learn what Uncle Eddie had really left him. And then he would decide whether to sell his inheritance or use it to build the kind of future that his newfound reputation suggested might be possible. The keys to the barn were hanging on a hook in Eddie's cluttered office, exactly where they had been gathering dust for the past 6 months while Marcus struggled to make sense of his inheritance. Tomorrow, everything would change. The morning sun had barely crested the horizon when Marcus made his way to the barn, Uncle Eddie's keys heavy in his palm like the weight of destiny itself. He had awakened before dawn with a restless energy that made sleep impossible, his mind churning with possibilities and fears in equal measure. The events of the previous day had fundamentally altered his understanding of both his inheritance and his own potential, transforming what he had dismissed as worthless junk into something that might represent the opportunity of a lifetime. Barn's exterior showed decades of weathering, its red paint faded to a rusty brown that blended with the autumn landscape. 2 massive sliding doors dominated the front facade, secured with heavy-duty padlocks that looked far more substantial than anything protecting the contents of a typical farm storage building. Marcus noted the thick steel hasps and reinforced Hinges, security measures that seemed excessive for protecting agricultural equipment or spare automotive parts. As he fumbled with the first lock, Marcus became aware of subtle details he had previously overlooked. The barn sat on a concrete foundation rather than the typical wooden posts used for agricultural buildings. Ventilation grates near the roofline were screened with fine mesh to prevent dust infiltration. Even the overhead electrical service was heavier than necessary for basic lighting, suggesting power requirements for sophisticated equipment. The first padlock clicked open with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the morning stillness. Marcus paused, listening for any indication that his activities had attracted attention, but the surrounding countryside remained peaceful. Second lock proved more stubborn, its mechanism corroded by years of exposure, but finally yielded to persistent pressure. With both locks removed, Marcus grasped the handle of the left door and pulled. The massive panel moved smoothly on well-maintained rollers, revealing that Eddie had invested in quality hardware, despite the building's rustic appearance. As the door slid open, revealing the first glimpse of the barn's interior, Marcus felt his breath catch in his throat. Even in the dim light filtering through the doorway, he could see the unmistakable silhouettes of automobiles arranged in neat rows throughout the cavernous space. But these weren't the rusted hulks he had expected based on Eddie's reputation as a collector of automotive detritus. Even covered with tarps and decades of accumulated dust, the shapes beneath suggested vehicles that had been carefully preserved rather than simply abandoned. Marcus pulled the second door open, flooding the barn with morning sunlight that revealed the true scope of Eddie's hidden collection. 2 rows of cars stretched from the front of the building to the rear wall, perhaps 20 vehicles in total, each one draped with heavy canvas tarps that had protected them from dust and moisture. The concrete floor was remarkably clean, with drain systems that indicated Eddie had designed the space for long-term automotive storage. His hands trembling slightly with anticipation, Marcus approached the nearest covered vehicle and grasped a corner of its protective tarp. The canvas was heavy and expensive, designed for serious preservation rather than casual protection. As he pulled it away, revealing the car beneath, Marcus felt his knees nearly buckle with shock. Sitting before him, in pristine condition that defied its decades of storage, was a 1970 Plymouth Cuda with the distinctive dual-scoop hood that marked it as a 446-pack model. The car's inviolate paint gleamed as if it had been detailed yesterday, its chrome bumpers and trim pieces reflecting the morning light like mirrors. Every visible detail suggested factory original condition, from the correct date-coded tires to the proper markings on all external components. Marcus walked slowly around the Cuda, his trained eye cataloging details that confirmed what he was seeing. The VENG tag was intact and matched the engine's casting numbers. The color combination was correct for the model year. Even the undercarriage showed the proper factory markings and date stamps that indicated this wasn't a restoration, but an actual survivor car that had been preserved in as-delivered condition. "Jesus Christ," Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible in the barn's cathedral-like space. He knew enough about the classic car market to understand that an original 446-pack Cuda in this condition was worth at least $100,000, possibly twice that depending on its documentation and rarity options. And there were 19 more cars waiting under their protective covers. Marcus moved to the next vehicle with growing excitement, pulling away its tarp to reveal a 1969 Dodge Charger RT in factory B5 blue. Like the Cuda, it appeared to be completely original, with the 440 Magnum engine and 4-speed transmission that made it one of the most desirable muscle cars ever produced. The odometer showed only 12,847 miles, a figure that seemed impossible until Marcus examined the car's documentation. Envelope taped to its windshield. Inside the envelope were the original window sticker, dealer invoice, warranty cards, and owner's manual, all confirming that this Charger had been purchased new in 1969 and driven sparingly before being placed in storage. The paperwork trail was complete, establishing provenance that would satisfy the most demanding collector or auction house. The third car made Marcus sit down heavily on a nearby workbench, overwhelmed by the implications of what he was discovering. A 1967 Shelby GT500, identical to Frank Kowalski's car, but showing only 2,100 miles on its odometer. The Wimbledon white paint was flawless, the blue racing stripes applied with factory precision. This wasn't just a rare car. It was essentially a new 1967 Shelby that had been preserved in museum-quality condition for over 50 years. Marcus spent the next 3 hours methodically uncovering and documenting each vehicle in Eddie's collection, his amazement growing with each revelation. A 1970 Chevelle SL6 with the legendary 450 horsepower engine. A 1969 Camaro Z28 with the Trans Am racing package. A 1968 Mustang GT500KR, the king of the road, that represented the pinnacle of Shelby's collaboration with Ford. Each car was more spectacular than the last, representing the absolute cream of American muscle car production from the golden era of high-performance street machines. But what made the collection truly extraordinary wasn't just the rarity of individual vehicles, but their uniformity of condition. Every car showed minimal mileage, complete documentation, and factory original specifications that would satisfy the most rigorous authentication process. As Marcus reached the rear of the barn, he discovered something that made him question whether he might be hallucinating from the overwhelming nature of his discoveries. Sitting beneath the final tarp was a 1971 Plymouth Cuda convertible in high-impact orange, equipped with the 426 Hemi engine that made it one of the rarest and most valuable muscle cars ever produced. The combination of body style, engine, and model year represented automotive unicorn territory, with examples selling at auction for prices that approached $1 million. But it was the car's documentation that truly took Marcus's breath away. Attached to the windshield was not just the usual envelope of paperwork, but a leather portfolio containing correspondence between Eddie and Chrysler's Special Vehicles Department. The letters, dating from 1971, detailed a special order placement for what the factory had designated as an engineering evaluation vehicle, essentially a prototype built to explore the limits of the Cuda platform. According to the documentation, only 3 such vehicles had been built, with 2 destroyed in testing and the third sold through a special arrangement to Eduardo Rivera, who had apparently worked as a consulting engineer for Chrysler during the muscle car era. The revelation that Uncle Eddie had been directly involved in the development of some of the most legendary performance cars ever built added another layer of significance to his hidden collection. Marcus sat in the driver's seat of the Hemi Cuda convertible, trying to process the magnitude of what he had inherited. Conservative estimates suggested that the 20 vehicles in Eddie's barn represented a combined value approaching $10 million. But several of the cars, particularly the one-off prototypes and ultra-low mileage examples, could command prices that pushed the total collection value well beyond any reasonable calculation. The financial implications were staggering, but Marcus found himself focusing on something more profound than mere monetary worth. This collection represented the automotive equivalent of a master's gallery, assembled by someone who understood not just the investment potential of these machines, but their significance as expressions of American engineering creativity during an era when manufacturers competed to build the fastest, most powerful streetcars imaginable. Eddie had somehow acquired and preserved examples of virtually every significant muscle car produced during the Golden Age, maintaining them in condition that bordered on the miraculous. The collection told the story of an entire automotive era through its finest representatives, each car a chapter in the narrative of American performance. Engineering. Marcus was startled from his contemplation by the sound of a vehicle approaching the barn. Through the open doors, he could see Richard Blackwood's distinctive Charger pulling into the driveway, followed by David Chen's Mercedes and a third car he didn't recognize. The convoy suggested coordination rather than coincidence, indicating that his earlier visitors had been monitoring his activities and had decided to respond to his investigation of the barn's contents. Blackwood was the first to reach the barn entrance, his practiced smile faltering as he took in the revealed collection. Behind him, Chen's expression shifted from professional confidence to barely concealed shock. The third man, elderly and well-dressed, moved with the careful deliberation of someone accustomed to high-stakes negotiations. "Mr. Rivera," Blackwood said, his voice tight with controlled emotion, "I see you've decided to explore your inheritance." Marcus stood slowly, aware that the dynamics of his situation had changed dramatically. Yesterday, he had been a struggling mechanic fielding lowball offers for unknown contents. Today, he stood surrounded by automotive treasures that represented generational wealth and historical significance. "Just taking inventory," Marcus replied carefully, noting how all three men were studying the collection with expressions that revealed both knowledge and hunger. The elderly man stepped forward, extending his hand with old-world courtesy. "Mr. Rivera, I'm Jonathan Westbrook from Westbrook Rare Automobiles. I believe my associates have been discussing various arrangements regarding your uncle's collection." Marcus recognized the name immediately. Westbrook Rare Automobiles was legendary in collector car circles, handling transactions for museums and the world's wealthiest enthusiasts. Jonathan Westbrook's presence indicated that word of Eddie's collection had reached the highest levels of the classic car world. "Gentlemen," Marcus said, his voice carrying new authority, "I think we need to have a more honest conversation about what exactly you've been trying to purchase." Blackwood's mask slipped completely, revealing frustration and calculation in equal measure. "Rivera, you don't understand what you're dealing with here. This collection represents obligations and arrangements that go back decades." "What kind of obligations?" Marcus asked, moving to position himself where he could see all three men clearly. Westbrook answered with the measured tones of someone accustomed to complex negotiations. "Your uncle Eduardo was not simply a collector, Mr. Rivera. He served as a curator and custodian for vehicles that were placed with him for safekeeping by various parties. Some of those arrangements included specific provisions for disposition of the vehicles upon his death." The implication was clear, and Marcus felt his brief euphoria beginning to cloud with complications. If some of the cars weren't actually Eddie's to bequeath, his inheritance might be far more complex than a simple collection of valuable automobiles. But as he looked around the barn at the 20 automotive masterpieces that surrounded him, Marcus realized that even partial ownership of this collection would transform his life completely. The question now was not whether he had inherited something valuable, but whether he possessed the knowledge and determination to navigate the complex world of collectors, dealers, and legal arrangements that his discovery had thrust him into. Morning sun, streaming through the barn's open doors, illuminated dust motes that danced in the air like golden possibilities, each one representing a different path forward for a man who had awakened thinking himself trapped by circumstances beyond his control. Marcus looked at the three men surrounding him, their expressions ranging from barely controlled frustration to calculating patience, and felt the familiar tightness in his chest that always preceded difficult conversations about his past. The morning light streaming through the barn's open doors seemed to dim as memories he had worked hard to suppress began surfacing with unwelcome clarity. "Before we discuss any arrangements or obligations," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the turmoil building within him, "I need to understand exactly what my uncle was involved in. And I think you gentlemen need to understand who you're dealing with." Westbrook adjusted his expensive glasses with the careful movements of a man accustomed to navigating delicate negotiations. Mr. Rivera, your Uncle Eduardo was far more than a simple mechanic or collector. He served as a trusted custodian for vehicles that required discrete storage arrangements, wealthy collectors, estate settlements, insurance recoveries. Many of these cars have complicated histories. The explanation felt incomplete, designed to reveal just enough information to establish legitimacy while concealing the full scope of whatever arrangements Eddie had made. Marcus had heard similar carefully worded explanations during his military service, usually from officers trying to justify missions that existed in moral gray areas. Discrete storage, Marcus repeated, walking slowly among the covered vehicles. You mean hiding stolen cars? Blackwood stepped forward aggressively. Nothing illegal, Rivera. But wealthy people sometimes need to relocate assets quickly, or estate attorneys need time to resolve complex inheritance disputes. Eduardo provided secure storage with complete confidentiality. The explanation rang false to Marcus's trained ear. During his years as a staff sergeant responsible for vehicle maintenance in Afghanistan, he had learned to detect deception in bureaucratic language. These men were circling around a truth they didn't want to reveal, just as commanding officers had done when explaining why certain convoy routes were classified, or why maintenance records for particular vehicles couldn't be shared with standard channels. How long have you been waiting for Eddie to die? Marcus asked directly, the question cutting through their polite maneuvering like a blade. Chen shifted uncomfortably, his attorney's training warring with obvious discomfort at the blunt inquiry. Mr. Rivera, your uncle's health issues were well known. We were simply preparing for eventual transition arrangements. The casual reference to Eddie's death as a business planning matter triggered something dark in Marcus's memory. He had heard similar language from military contractors discussing casualty projections, reducing human lives to logistical considerations. The parallel brought back sensations he had worked years to suppress: the smell of diesel fuel and cordite, the weight of body armor in 120-degree heat, the sound of improvised explosive devices detonating beneath convoy vehicles. Marcus closed his eyes briefly, using breathing techniques learned in VA therapy sessions to maintain control. When he opened them, the three men were studying him with renewed attention, clearly noting the brief moment of vulnerability. You're having flashbacks, Westbrook observed with surprising gentleness. Combat veteran? The question was asked with the kind of recognition that suggested personal familiarity with the symptoms. Marcus studied the elderly man more carefully, noting details he had missed initially: the precise posture that spoke of military training, the watchful alertness that never fully faded from career soldiers, the way Westbrook positioned himself to maintain visual contact with all potential threats. Afghanistan, Marcus confirmed. 2 tours, convoy security, and vehicle maintenance. Westbrook nodded slowly. Vietnam, 1st Cavalry Division. Different war, same demons. He gestured toward the collection surrounding them. Your uncle mentioned that his nephew was struggling with readjustment issues. He was quite proud of your military service, even though he worried about what it had cost you. The reference to Eddie's concern hit Marcus unexpectedly hard. During his childhood visits to the garage, his uncle had always seemed too absorbed in his automotive projects to pay much attention to family dynamics. The idea that Eddie had been following his military career and subsequent struggles suggested a level of care that Marcus had never recognized. He knew about Detroit? Marcus asked, referring to the job he had lost after his PTSD symptoms made it impossible to maintain the focus required for assembly line work. He knew about everything, Westbrook replied quietly. The panic attacks during night shifts, the incident with the supervisor who pushed you too hard, the way Ford's management decided it was easier to eliminate a problem employee rather than accommodate a veteran's service-connected disabilities. Marcus felt his jaw tighten as suppressed anger rose toward the surface. The Ford plant job had represented his attempt to rebuild a normal life after military service, using mechanical skills developed in the Army to earn steady wages in civilian employment. For 8 months, he had managed to hide the worst symptoms of his PTSD, arriving early and staying late to compensate for the moments when flashbacks made it impossible to concentrate on assembly line tasks. The breaking point had come during a particularly demanding production quota period, when Supervisor Danny Walsh had decided that Marcus's occasional lapses in attention represented laziness rather than medical issues. The confrontation had escalated when Walsh began using military terminology mockingly, referring to Marcus as Soldier Boy, and suggesting that veterans received preferential treatment they didn't deserve. Marcus had managed to walk away from that confrontation without violence, but the damage was done. Within a week, he found himself facing disciplinary action for insubordination and failure to maintain production standards. The union representative had advised him to accept termination, rather than fight charges that would follow him to other employers. "How does Eddie know about Ford?" Marcus asked. Though part of him already suspected the answer, Westbrook reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a manila envelope, yellowed with age and bearing Marcus's name in Eddie's distinctive handwriting. "He asked me to give you this. If something happened to him before you two had a chance to talk properly." Marcus accepted the envelope with hands that trembled slightly, recognizing his uncle's careful script. The paper felt substantial, containing multiple documents rather than a simple letter. As he opened it, the first item that emerged was a photograph he had never seen before, himself at age 19, standing proudly beside a Humvee in full military dress uniform, taken during his first deployment to Afghanistan. Beneath the photograph was a letter written in Eddie's meticulous handwriting, dated just 3 months before his death. "Marcus, if you're reading this, I'm gone and you've finally discovered what I've been saving for you. I know you think I never paid attention during your visits, but I've been watching your whole life. Proud as hell of the man you became, even when the world seemed determined to break you down. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. I heard about what happened at Ford through connections I still have in the automotive industry. Danny Walsh made the mistake of bragging about putting a troublemaker veteran in his place to the wrong people. Some of us old-timers remember when companies actually valued the skills and sacrifice that military service represents. The cars in this barn aren't just an investment, son. They're your future if you want it. Every vehicle here has been restored to absolute perfection, documented completely, and prepared for sale to collectors who understand what they're buying. Conservative estimates put the total value at $12 million, but several pieces could bring significantly more at the right auction. More importantly, this collection represents credibility in the classic car world. Ownership of these vehicles will establish you as a serious player among collectors and restoration specialists. With your knowledge and these cars as your foundation, you could build the kind of business that would honor both your mechanical abilities and your service to our country. The 3 men who are probably standing around you as you read this have been circling like vultures for 2 years, waiting for me to die so they could acquire this collection at a fraction of its value. They've made various arrangements and agreements that they'll claim give them legal rights to individual vehicles. Don't believe a word of it. Every car in this barn is yours free and clear. I spent 30 years acquiring and restoring them specifically to provide you with options that your service-connected disabilities made difficult to achieve through conventional employment. The documentation for each vehicle is complete and stored in the office safe. Combination the 7th of December 85, your birth date. Use this gift wisely, Marcus. You've earned it through service and sacrifice that these civilians couldn't comprehend if they lived a dozen lifetimes. And remember that sometimes the best revenge against people who underestimate veterans is to succeed so completely that they have to respect you whether they want to or not. Your proud uncle, Eduardo Rivera. P.S. The Hemi Cuda convertible was always intended to be yours to keep. I restarted thinking about the boy who used to help me in the garage, imagining the man he would become. Don't ever sell that one. Marcus read the letter twice, his vision blurring with emotions he hadn't experienced since Sarah's funeral. The revelation that Eddie had been orchestrating this inheritance for years, specifically designed to provide opportunities that Marcus's disabilities had made difficult to pursue through traditional channels, reframed everything about his current situation. The three men waited in tense silence as Marcus folded the letter and looked up at them with new understanding. Gentlemen, I think there's been a misunderstanding about the legal status of these vehicles. Blackwood's expression darkened. Rivera, you don't understand the complexities involved here. These aren't simple ownership situations. Actually, I understand perfectly, Marcus replied, his voice carrying new authority. You've been waiting for my uncle to die so you could pressure his heir into quick sales at below market prices. Unfortunately for you, Eddie anticipated your strategy and prepared accordingly. He walked to the Hemi Cuda convertible and pulled away its protective cover, revealing the stunning high-impact orange paint that gleamed like liquid fire in the morning sunlight. This particular car, for example, was restored specifically for me over a period of 3 years. According to the documentation, it's never been offered for sale to anyone. Chen stepped forward, his attorney's instincts recognizing the shift in negotiating dynamics. Mr. Rivera, even if the legal ownership is clear, you're dealing with a market that requires specific expertise and connections. Without proper representation, you could lose millions of dollars to inexperienced handling of these assets. The comment was probably true, but Marcus had learned during his military service to be suspicious of people who offered help while simultaneously emphasizing his own inadequacy. These men wanted the collection badly enough to coordinate their approach and present themselves as his only viable option for realizing its value. I appreciate your concern, Marcus said diplomatically, but I think I need some time to review all the documentation before making any decisions about representation or sales. Westbrook's expression shifted to something approaching respect. A prudent approach, Mr. Rivera, but I hope you'll consider that this collection represents more than financial assets. These cars are historically significant examples of American automotive engineering. They deserve to be owned by people who understand their cultural importance. The comment carried implications that Marcus recognized from his dealings with military officers who believed that certain responsibilities were too important to be left to enlisted personnel. Westbrook was suggesting that Marcus, despite legal ownership, lacked the cultural sophistication necessary to be a proper custodian of such significant vehicles. Mr. Westbrook, Marcus said quietly, I spent 10 years maintaining vehicles that were literally matters of life and death for the soldiers who depended on them. I think I understand the responsibilities that come with caring for important machines. As the three men departed with varying degrees of frustration and resignation, Marcus stood alone among the 20 automotive masterpieces that his uncle had preserved for him. The letter had transformed his understanding not just of his inheritance, but of his own worth as a man whose sacrifices and struggles had been recognized and honored by someone who truly understood their significance. For the first time since his discharge from the Army, Marcus felt that his future might hold possibilities beyond simple survival. Within hours of the three men's departure, Marcus discovered that news of the collection's discovery traveled through the classic car community with the speed of wildfire across dry grassland. His phone began ringing incessantly with calls from collectors, auction houses, automotive journalists, and insurance specialists, each wanting to confirm rumors about the Rivera collection that had apparently been circulating in hushed conversations. For years, the first call came from Jerry Patterson at Barrett Jackson, his voice tight with excitement and disbelief. Marcus, I've been getting calls all morning from people claiming you found some kind of lost treasure trove in your uncle's barn. Please tell me this isn't some elaborate hoax." "It's real, Jerry," Marcus confirmed, looking out at the barn, where sunlight continued to illuminate the automotive masterpieces that had been hidden for decades. 20 cars, all original, most with under 5,000 miles. Documentation appears complete on everything I've examined so far. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that Marcus began to wonder if the call had been disconnected. Finally, Patterson's voice returned, hushed with the reverence typically reserved for religious experiences. "Jesus Christ, Marcus, do you understand what you're sitting on? If even half of what I'm hearing is accurate, you're looking at the single most significant barn find in automotive history. We're talking about cars that collectors assumed were lost forever." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Patterson explaining the authentication process that would be necessary to establish provenance and condition for potential auction. "I'm going to make some calls," he concluded. "There are people who need to see this collection, experts who can help you understand exactly what your uncle preserved." No sooner had Marcus ended that conversation than his phone rang again, this time displaying a number he didn't recognize. The caller identified himself as Vincent DeMarcus from Hagerty Insurance, the leading specialty insurer for collector automobiles. "Mr. Rivera, I'm calling about your uncle's collection. We've been tracking rumors about Eduardo Rivera's private hoard for over a decade, but frankly, most of us assumed they were exaggerated stories that grew in the telling." Marcus found himself repeatedly explaining the discovery while trying to maintain some semblance of normal business operations. Customers continued arriving for routine repairs, drawn by word-of-mouth recommendations about his expertise with classic cars. But now they found themselves witnessing something unprecedented in the automotive world. Frank Kowalski returned from his car show in Springfield, his GT500 running perfectly after Marcus's repairs. But instead of the simple thank you visit Marcus expected, Frank brought with him 3 other Shelby owners who had heard about both the engine work and the barn discovery. "Marcus," Frank said, his face flushed with excitement, "tell them what you found. Show them what Eduardo left you." Word of the collection had reached the Springfield car show within hours, spreading through the gathered enthusiasts like an electric current. By the time Frank's group departed for home, half the show's participants had heard some version of the story, and phone calls were already being made to collectors, dealers, and automotive media across the country. The most significant call came from Margaret Caldwell, senior automotive specialist at Sotheby's auction house in New York. Her voice carried the cultured authority of someone accustomed to handling transactions involving the world's most valuable collectibles. "Mr. Rivera, I'm calling regarding your uncle's automotive collection. Sotheby's has been aware of Eduardo Rivera's restoration work for many years, and we've had several clients express interest in acquiring pieces from his personal collection, should they ever become available." The conversation took an unexpected turn when Caldwell revealed the extent of the art world's knowledge about Eddie's activities. "Your uncle was quite famous in certain circles, Mr. Rivera. Not famous in the sense of public recognition, but famous among the people who matter in the collector car world. Museum curators, serious private collectors, restoration specialists. Eduardo Rivera's work was considered the gold standard for authentic muscle car restoration." Marcus felt a familiar sense of disorientation as his understanding of his uncle's legacy continued to evolve. "I had no idea he was known outside of this area. Mr. Rivera, your uncle restored vehicles for some of the most significant private collections in the world. The Peterson Museum in Los Angeles has 2 of his restorations in their permanent display. Jay Leno owns 3 cars that Eduardo worked on. When we heard that his personal collection might become available, several of our clients immediately expressed serious interest. The implications were staggering. If Eddie's reputation extended to institutions like the Peterson Museum and Collectors like Jay Leno, then the cars in the barn represented more than valuable commodities. They were art pieces created by a recognized master craftsman, with provenance that would satisfy the most demanding authentication requirements. Miss Caldwell, what kind of values are we discussing for a collection like this? Her pause was brief, but significant. Mr. Rivera, depending on the specific vehicles and their condition, we could be looking at individual cars valued between $500,000 and $2 million. For the collection as a whole, assuming proper authentication and documentation, I would estimate somewhere between $15 and $25 million at auction. The figure was so far beyond Marcus's previous conception of wealth that he found himself struggling to process its reality. $25 million represented generational money, the kind of sum that would transform not just his life, but the lives of his descendants for decades to come. But even as he absorbed the financial implications, Marcus found his attention drawn to something Caldwell had mentioned almost casually. You said individual cars might be worth up to $2 million. Which cars command those kinds of prices? Prototype vehicles, one-off factory specials, ultra-low production models with complete documentation. Based on what we know about your uncle's collection habits, he may have acquired examples that museums and serious collectors have been seeking for decades. After ending the call with Caldwell, Marcus walked back to the barn with new appreciation for what Eddie had preserved. As he moved among the covered vehicles, he began to understand that his uncle hadn't simply collected valuable cars. He had curated an automotive museum that told the complete story of American muscle car development during its golden era. The afternoon brought unexpected visitors in the form of Dr. James Mitchell and Dr. Sarah Chen from the Automotive Engineering Department at Michigan State University. They arrived in a pristine 1969 Boss 429 Mustang, their professional credentials immediately apparent in their systematic approach to examining the collection. Mr. Rivera, Dr. Mitchell began, we've driven down from East Lansing after receiving calls from several colleagues about your uncle's collection. From an academic standpoint, what you've preserved here represents an invaluable resource for understanding muscle car development during the 1960s and early 1970s. Dr. Chen moved among the vehicles with the analytical eye of someone trained to recognize historical significance beyond mere monetary value. These aren't just rare cars, Mr. Rivera. They're primary source documents that tell the story of American automotive engineering during its most creative period. As the professors examined individual vehicles, Marcus found himself serving as an impromptu tour guide, sharing details about each car's specifications and restoration history based on Eddie's meticulous documentation. To his surprise, he discovered that his years of study and practical experience allowed him to speak knowledgeably about technical details that impressed even the academic experts. Your understanding of these systems is remarkable, Dr. Mitchell observed after Marcus explained the differences between various Hemi engine configurations. Have you considered that your knowledge, combined with ownership of this collection, could position you as a significant authority in the field? The comment echoed something Jerry Patterson had mentioned, the idea that Marcus's situation represented more than a financial windfall. The collection provided credibility and access to a world where his mechanical expertise would be valued at the highest levels. Dr. Mitchell, what exactly do you mean by authority in the field? Consulting work for museums, authentication services for collectors, expert testimony for insurance, and legal proceedings involving high-value vehicles. The classic car world desperately needs people who combine theoretical knowledge with practical experience. Your military background in vehicle maintenance, plus your obvious understanding of these specific systems, plus ownership of this collection, that's a combination that could command substantial fees. Dr. Chen nodded enthusiastically. We'd love to discuss the possibility of academic collaboration, case studies, research projects, maybe even guest lectures for our automotive engineering students. The university would be very interested in establishing a formal relationship. As the professors prepared to leave, Dr. Mitchell handed Marcus a business card along with a comprehensive reading list. These books will help you understand the market forces and historical context that make your collection so significant. Knowledge is power in the collector car world. Mr. Rivera, the more you understand about what you own, the better position you'll be in to make informed decisions about its future. That evening, as Marcus sat in his small apartment reviewing the day's conversations and revelations, he felt the same sense of possibility that had first emerged during his work on Frank Kowalski's GT500. But now that possibility had expanded beyond simple mechanical competence to encompass expertise that was genuinely valued by institutions and individuals at the highest levels of the automotive world. His phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Mr. Rivera, this is Jonathan Westbrook. I'd like to schedule a private meeting to discuss a business proposition that could be mutually beneficial. The collection represents opportunities beyond simple sales transactions. Please call at your convenience." Marcus stared at the message, recognizing that Westbrook's tone had shifted from the morning's subtle threats to something approaching respect. The elderly dealer had apparently spent the day making inquiries about both the collection and Marcus himself, and whatever he had discovered had changed his approach significantly. A second text arrived from Richard Blackwood. "Rivera, you need to understand that there are complications with some of those vehicles that go beyond ownership issues. Call me before you make any commitments to other parties. Some of those cars have histories that could create serious legal problems." The contrasting messages suggested that Marcus's position had become more complex as various parties reassessed both the collection's value and his own capabilities. Where the morning had brought barely concealed condescension, the afternoon's contacts reflected growing recognition that he might be more than a simple inheritor of valuable assets. Marcus walked to his window and looked out at the barn, where 20 automotive masterpieces waited under their protective covers. 48 hours ago, he had been a struggling mechanic whose future seemed limited to barely profitable repairs on aging vehicles. Tonight, he found himself at the center of the classic car world's attention, with opportunities and complications that he was only beginning to understand. The phone rang again, this time displaying a number with a New York area code. Marcus answered to find himself speaking with someone from Road and Track magazine, wanting to schedule an interview about the greatest barn find in automotive history. As Marcus politely deferred the interview request while promising to consider future media opportunities, he realized that his quiet life in Millfield was ending. The discovery of Eddie's collection had thrust him into a world where his mechanical knowledge and military experience were valued commodities, where decisions about individual vehicles could mean the difference between comfortable retirement and generational wealth. But along with the opportunities came pressures and complexities that he was only beginning to recognize. The competing interests of dealers, collectors, museums, and media represented a landscape that would require careful navigation to avoid the kind of exploitation that had characterized his previous encounters with corporate America. Tomorrow, Marcus decided he would begin the process of education that would prepare him to make informed decisions about his inheritance and his future. The next morning brought an event that Marcus would later recognize as the moment when his life crossed permanently from one realm into another. He was opening the garage at dawn, preparing for what he expected to be another day of phone calls and curious visitors, when the distinctive sound of multiple high-performance engines announced the arrival of something unprecedented in Millfield's quiet history. A convoy of exotic automobiles was approaching down Main Street, their combined engine notes creating a symphony that brought residents to their windows and doorsteps. Leading the procession was a pristine 1967 Ferrari 275 G2B4, followed by a Lamborghini Miura, a Porsche 911 Carrera RS, and 3 additional vehicles that Marcus recognized as representing millions of dollars in combined value. The convoy pulled into his driveway with choreographed precision, their occupants emerging with the confident bearing of people accustomed to commanding attention and respect. At their head was a woman in her early 60s, silver-haired and impeccably dressed, who approached Marcus with the purposeful stride of someone accustomed to making important things happen quickly. "Mr. Rivera," she said, extending her hand. With firm authority, "I'm Victoria Pemberton from the Pemberton Collection. I believe my reputation precedes me." Marcus accepted her handshake while his mind raced to process the significance of her presence. The Pemberton Collection was legendary in automotive circles, one of the world's most prestigious private museums, housing over 300 of the finest automobiles ever created. Victoria Pemberton herself was regularly featured in magazines like Classic Car and Rob Report, her opinions on automotive matters carrying weight that could influence market values and collector preferences globally. "Ms. Pemberton, this is quite an honor. What brings you to Millfield?" Her smile carried the satisfaction of someone who had achieved a significant objective through careful planning. "Mr. Rivera, I've spent the past 18 hours making calls, reviewing documentation, and consulting with experts about your uncle's collection. What I've learned has convinced me that we're dealing with something that transcends normal collector car transactions." She gestured toward her companions, each of whom Marcus now recognized from automotive media coverage. "Allow me to introduce Dr. William Hartley from the Henry Ford Museum, James Morrison from R.M. Sotheby's, Maria Santos from Classic Car Magazine, and Robert Kim from the Concours d'Elegance at Pebble Beach." The introductions hit Marcus like successive waves, each name representing a level of expertise and influence that he had previously encountered only through magazine, articles, and television coverage. These were the people who determined which cars were displayed at the world's most prestigious events, whose opinions shaped collector preferences and market values. "Mr. Rivera," Dr. Hartley said, his voice carrying the measured authority of institutional expertise, "if the preliminary reports about your uncle's collection are accurate, we may be looking at automotive artifacts that belong in major museums rather than private hands." The comment was delivered diplomatically, but Marcus recognized the underlying implication. These people had come to assess not just the collection's value, but his fitness as its custodian. They were evaluating whether a small-town mechanic possessed the knowledge and judgment necessary to make appropriate decisions about historically significant automobiles. "Perhaps we could examine the collection?" Victoria suggested, though her tone made it clear that this was more command than request. Marcus led the group to the barn, acutely aware of their professional scrutiny as they took in details that revealed the scope and sophistication of Eddie's preservation efforts. As he opened the doors and began removing protective covers, he watched their expressions shift from polite interest to genuine amazement. "Dear God," James Morrison breathed as the 1970 Plymouth Cuda was revealed in all its pristine glory. "This is the inviolate six-pack that disappeared from the Chrysler Museum inventory in 1985. We assumed it had been destroyed." Dr. Hartley moved immediately to the Hemi Cuda convertible, his trained eye cataloging details that confirmed its authenticity and significance. "This is one of the engineering prototypes. We have documentation at the Henry Ford Museum about this specific vehicle. It was supposed to have been scrapped after testing." As each car was uncovered, the group's excitement became increasingly palpable. These weren't simply valuable automobiles, but missing pieces of automotive history that collectors and institutions had been seeking for decades. Maria Santos was photographing everything with professional intensity, already composing what Marcus realized would become a major feature article. "Mr. Rivera," Victoria said after they had examined roughly half the collection, "I need to be direct with you about something. This collection represents more than private ownership opportunities. These cars are cultural artifacts that tell the story of American automotive engineering during its most creative period. Marcus sensed the direction of her argument, recognizing the same institutional condescension he had encountered from military officers who believed important decisions were too complex for enlisted personnel to understand properly. Miss Pemberton, I appreciate the historical significance of what my uncle preserved. But I also understand that he spent 30 years preparing this inheritance specifically for me. Of course, she replied smoothly, and I'm sure Eduardo had his reasons. But consider the broader implications. Individual ownership means these cars could be scattered to different collectors, their educational value lost. Institutional stewardship ensures they remain together as a complete historical narrative. Robert Kim from Pebble Beach stepped forward with obvious excitement. Mr. Rivera, I'd like to propose something unprecedented. What if we featured your entire collection as the centerpiece of next year's Concours d'Elegance? 20 cars displayed together with you as the featured owner. It would be the automotive event of the decade. The proposal was breathtaking in its implications. The Pebble Beach Concours d'Elegance represented the pinnacle of automotive exhibition, where the world's most prestigious collectors displayed their finest vehicles before audiences that included celebrities, industry leaders, and automotive royalty. Being featured there would establish Marcus as a major figure in the collector car world overnight. The exposure would be extraordinary, Maria Santos added enthusiastically. Cover stories in every major automotive publication, documentary film opportunities, speaking engagements at collector events worldwide. You'd become the public face of muscle car preservation. Marcus found himself struggling to process the magnitude of what was being offered. 6 months ago, he had been an unemployed veteran whose future seemed limited to basic survival. Now he was being offered opportunities to participate at the highest levels of the automotive world, with recognition that could establish him as a global authority on American muscle cars. But something in the group's eager enthusiasm triggered his military-trained skepticism about offers that seemed too good to be true. During his Army service, he had learned to be wary of superior officers who presented obviously beneficial orders with excessive enthusiasm, as such presentations often concealed complications or personal agendas. These are very generous offers, Marcus said carefully, but I'd need to understand what obligations would come with such arrangements. Victoria's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, revealing calculation beneath her polished exterior. Naturally, proper display and documentation would require expert oversight. The Pemberton Collection would be happy to provide curatorial services, ensuring that each vehicle is presented with appropriate historical context. Dr. Hartley nodded enthusiastically. The Henry Ford Museum has extensive experience with traveling exhibitions. We could develop educational materials that would accompany the collection wherever it's displayed. Marcus recognized what was happening with uncomfortable clarity. These prestigious institutions were maneuvering to gain control over his collection through arrangements that would gradually transfer decision-making authority from him to their professional staffs. The prestige and exposure they offered would come at the cost of his independence as the collection's owner. I appreciate all of these opportunities, Marcus said firmly, but I think I need time to consider the implications before making any commitments. The group exchanged glances that revealed their surprise at his reluctance to immediately accept offers that most people would consider dreams come true. Victoria's expression hardened slightly, suggesting that she wasn't accustomed to having her proposals declined. Mr. Rivera, she said with carefully controlled patience, opportunities like these don't remain available indefinitely. The automotive world moves quickly, and timing is crucial for establishing proper recognition. The veiled threat was familiar from Marcus's previous encounters with corporate manipulation, the suggestion that his circumstances made him vulnerable to missing once-in-a-lifetime opportunities through excessive caution or inadequate understanding of complex situations. I understand the time constraints, Marcus replied evenly. But these decisions are too important to make without proper consideration of all factors involved. As the group prepared to leave, their enthusiasm dampened by his unexpected resistance. To their offers, Victoria made one final attempt to establish leverage. Mr. Rivera, I hope you'll consider that this collection represents responsibilities and extend beyond personal ownership. These cars are part of American automotive heritage. They deserve to be seen and studied by people who can appreciate their historical significance. After the convoy departed, leaving Main Street quiet except for the lingering scent of high-octane fuel and the whispered conversations of neighbors who had witnessed the unprecedented visitation, Marcus stood alone among his uncle's cars and contemplated what had just occurred. The morning's events had confirmed that his collection represented far more than valuable assets. These were cultural artifacts whose ownership carried responsibilities and opportunities that extended well beyond personal financial security. But they had also revealed that the automotive world's elite were eager to gain control over the collection through arrangements that would gradually diminish his authority as its owner. His phone buzzed with a text message from Jerry Patterson. Marcus, heard about this morning's visit. Don't let them railroad you into institutional arrangements. You hold all the cards here. Call me when you're ready to discuss strategy. A second message arrived from Jonathan Westbrook. Mr. Rivera, after this morning's developments, I believe you need independent representation to navigate the competing interests now surrounding your collection. Would you consider a private meeting to discuss protective strategies? As Marcus walked through the barn, looking at the 20 automotive masterpieces that had thrust him into a world of unprecedented opportunities and complex pressures, he realized that Uncle Eddie's final gift had been more than valuable cars. It had been the chance to discover his own worth in a context where his knowledge and judgment would be tested against the most demanding standards. The question now was whether he possessed the wisdom and strength to maintain control over his inheritance while navigating a world where everyone seemed to have opinions about what he should do with cars that belonged to him alone. Looking at the Hemi Cuda convertible that Eddie had designated as his personal car, never to be sold, Marcus made a decision that surprised him with its clarity. Tomorrow he would begin the process of establishing himself not as a grateful recipient of others' expertise, but as an independent authority whose knowledge and ownership rights would be respected on his own terms. The automotive world might be eager to help him manage his inheritance, but Marcus Rivera had not survived military service and corporate betrayal to surrender control of his future to people whose primary interest was gaining access to his uncle's extraordinary legacy. That evening, Marcus made a decision that would define his approach to the complex situation surrounding his inheritance. Instead of allowing various parties to dictate the terms of engagement, he would establish his own expertise publicly and demonstrate that he deserved respect as more than simply a fortunate inheritor of valuable assets. His first call was to Frank Kowalski, the GT500 owner whose car had started this extraordinary chain of events. Frank, I need a favor. Do you know any journalists who cover the classic car scene professionally? People who would be interested in telling the real story about what I've discovered. Frank's enthusiasm was immediate. Marcus, I know exactly who you need to talk to. Kevin Walsh from Hemmings Motor News. He's been covering barn finds and restoration stories for 20 years, and he's got a reputation for fairness. Unlike some of these magazine people who just want sensational headlines. The connection proved fortuitous. Within an hour, Marcus found himself in a detailed phone conversation with Walsh, a veteran automotive journalist whose knowledge of muscle car history rivaled that of any curator or academic expert. Unlike the morning's visitors, Walsh seemed genuinely interested in understanding Marcus's perspective rather than simply cataloging the collection's contents. Mr. Rivera, what I'm hearing about your uncle's collection is extraordinary, but what interests me more is your own background. Word is getting around that you're not just a lucky inheritor, but someone with genuine expertise in these machines. Marcus found Walsh's direct approach refreshing after the morning's diplomatic maneuvering. "I've been studying these cars since I was a kid, and I spent 10 years maintaining complex vehicle systems in the Army, but I think what sets me apart is that I understand how these engines are supposed to feel when everything's working correctly." "Can you give me an example?" Marcus described his work on Frank Kowalski's GT500, explaining how he had diagnosed timing and carburetor issues that other mechanics had missed. As he spoke, he realized that his military experience had taught him diagnostic approaches that complemented his intuitive understanding of mechanical systems. "That's exactly the kind of insight that separates real expertise from book learning," Walsh observed. "And from what I'm hearing, your uncle's collection is going to establish you as one of the most significant figures in the muscle car world overnight. How are you handling the pressure?" The question was perceptive, addressing the psychological challenges that Marcus had been struggling with as various parties attempted to influence his decisions. "Honestly, Kevin, it's overwhelming. Everyone seems to have opinions about what I should do with cars that belong to me. But I'm starting to realize that respect in this world comes from demonstrating knowledge, not from accepting other people's authority." Walsh chuckled appreciatively. "Smart attitude. Too many people get intimidated by the institutional names and fancy credentials. But at the end of the day, either you know these cars or you don't, and either you own them or you don't." The conversation continued for another hour, with Walsh asking detailed questions about specific vehicles and Marcus's plans for the collection. By the time they ended the call, Marcus had agreed to an exclusive interview and photo shoot that would be featured as Hemming's cover story, establishing his narrative before other publications could define him according to their own agendas. The next morning brought validation of Marcus's strategic thinking in the form of unexpected support from an authoritative source. Dr. Eleanor Hoffman arrived at the garage driving her pristine Charger RT, but this time she wasn't alone. Accompanying her was a man Marcus recognized from automotive documentaries, Wayne Carini, host of Chasing Classic Cars, and one of the most respected voices in the collector automobile world. "Marcus," Dr. Hoffman said with obvious satisfaction, "I took the liberty of describing your situation to Wayne during a phone conversation last night. He was intrigued enough to drive down from Connecticut to meet you personally." Carini's approach was characteristically direct and unpretentious. "Marcus, I've been in this business for 40 years, and I've never heard about a barn find that generated this much excitement this quickly. Eleanor tells me you're getting pressure from all directions about what to do with your uncle's collection." "That's an understatement," Marcus replied, appreciating Carini's straightforward manner. "Everyone seems to think they know what's best for cars they've never owned." "Yeah, I've seen that movie before," Carini said with obvious distaste. "Rich people and institutions think ownership is just about having money to buy things. They don't understand that real ownership means taking responsibility for preserving and appreciating what you've got." As they walked toward the barn, Carini explained his perspective on the collector car world's dynamics. "Marcus, you're in a unique position here. Most barn finds involve cars that need extensive restoration, so the finder has to rely on other people's expertise and resources. But your uncle did all that work already, which means you're holding finished masterpieces that establish your credibility automatically." The observation was astute, highlighting advantages that Marcus had been too overwhelmed to recognize fully. His inheritance wasn't just valuable cars, but completed restoration projects that demonstrated Eddie's expertise while establishing Marcus's position as their rightful custodian. When Carini saw the collection, his reaction was everything Marcus could have hoped for from someone whose opinion carried weight throughout the automotive world. "Jesus Christ, Marcus. This isn't just a barn find, it's a time capsule. Your uncle preserved the complete evolution of American muscle car engineering in museum-quality condition." But it was Carini's next comment that provided Marcus with the Strategic insight he had been seeking. You know what makes this collection really special? It's not just the cars, it's the documentation. Your uncle created provenance that institutions spend decades trying to establish. That gives you authority. That money can't buy. Dr. Hoffman nodded enthusiastically. That's exactly what I tried to explain to Victoria Pemberton when she called me yesterday. She seemed to think that Marcus would be grateful for their institutional oversight. Karini's expression darkened. Victoria called you? That woman's been trying to get her hands on important cars for years, always with the same song and dance about educational responsibility and proper stewardship. What she really wants is to add prestigious pieces to her collection without paying fair market value. The confirmation of Marcus's instinctive suspicions about Victoria's motivations reinforced his decision to maintain independence rather than accepting institutional arrangements that sounded prestigious but would diminish his control. Wayne, Marcus said, what would you do if you were in my position? Karini's answer was immediate and definitive. I'd establish myself as the expert on these specific cars before anyone else could claim that authority. Document everything, learn everything, become the person that other experts have to consult when questions arise about American muscle car authenticity and restoration. How do I do that practically? Start by working with Kevin Walsh on that. Hemming's article. Make sure it establishes your technical knowledge, not just your ownership of valuable assets. Then begin selectively sharing cars with events where your expertise will be recognized and respected, not just your willingness to loan prestigious vehicles. Dr. Hoffman added her own perspective. Marcus, consider offering authentication services for muscle cars that come up for sale. Your combination of technical knowledge and ownership of documented examples would make you the definitive authority on originality and restoration quality. The suggestions aligned perfectly with Marcus's emerging understanding of his situation. Rather than allowing others to define his role as a lucky inheritor who needed expert guidance, he could establish himself as an expert whose opinions and services would be sought by collectors and institutions. His phone rang, interrupting the conversation. The caller ID showed Richard Blackwood's number, and Marcus answered with new confidence about how to handle the dealer's continued pressure. Rivera, I hope you're not making any commitments to those museum people, Blackwood said without preamble. There are legal complications involving some of those cars that they don't understand. What kind of legal complications? Marcus asked, putting the call on speaker so Carini and Dr. Hoffman could hear. Insurance recovery situations, estate settlements that were never finalized, ownership disputes that predate your uncle's acquisition of certain vehicles. You could find yourself in court defending your right to cars that other parties have legitimate claims against. Carini's expression suggested he had heard similar threats before. He gestured for Marcus to continue the conversation while he listened for revealing details. Mr. Blackwood, if there are legitimate legal issues, I assume you have documentation to support these claims? The pause before Blackwood's response was telling. These are complex situations that require expert legal representation to resolve properly. I'm offering to handle those complications as part of our purchase arrangement. What purchase arrangement? Marcus asked. I haven't agreed to sell anything to anyone. Rivera, you need to be realistic about your situation. Legal challenges could tie up this collection for years while attorneys get rich fighting over ownership. Disputes. My clients are prepared to purchase everything immediately, eliminating any risk of prolonged litigation. Carini was shaking his head vigorously, clearly recognizing Blackwood's tactics as intimidation rather than legitimate legal counsel. Dr. Hoffman's expression suggested similar skepticism about the dealer's claims. Mr. Blackwood, I appreciate your concern, but I'll handle any legal issues through my own representation. After ending the call, Carini's assessment was blunt. That's classic pressure sales technique, Marcus. Create urgency through fear, that offer to solve problems that probably don't exist. If there were serious ownership disputes involving these cars, we would have heard about them years ago. Dr. Hoffman agreed. Eduardo was meticulous about documentation and legal ownership. If Richard Blackwood had legitimate claims against any of these vehicles, he would have pursued them while Eduardo was alive. The morning's events had provided Marcus with strategic guidance from people whose expertise and integrity he trusted, along with confirmation that his instincts about various parties' motivations had been accurate. More importantly, he now had a clear path forward that would establish his authority rather than surrendering it to others. That afternoon, Marcus began implementing the strategy that Carini and Dr. Hoffman had outlined. His first step was calling Jerry Patterson to discuss authentication services and consulting opportunities. His second was reaching out to Kevin Walsh to schedule the Hemmings interview and photo shoot. His third was contacting a local attorney who specialized in collector car transactions to review all documentation and ensure his legal position was properly protected. By evening, Marcus had established a timeline for asserting his expertise and independence. The Hemmings article would introduce him to the collector car world as a knowledgeable owner rather than a fortunate inheritor. Authentication consulting would establish his technical authority while generating income that didn't require selling any vehicles. Legal review would eliminate any vulnerability to the kind of pressure tactics that Blackwood and others were attempting to use. As he stood in the barn that evening, looking at the 20 automotive masterpieces that had transformed his life, Marcus felt a satisfaction that went beyond financial security. For the first time since his military discharge, he was building a future based on his own knowledge and decisions, rather than accepting limitations imposed by other people's assessments of his capabilities. Uncle Eddie's final gift hadn't just been valuable cars. It had been the opportunity to discover that respect and authority could be earned through expertise and determination. Regardless of the circumstances that had brought him to this point, tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities. But Marcus now faced them with confidence that he possessed both the knowledge and the resolve necessary to succeed on his own terms. 6 months later, Marcus Rivera stood at the podium of the Barrett-Jackson auction house, watching his carefully selected 1969 Dodge Charger RT cross the block at $1.2 million. But this wasn't about the money anymore. The Hammer felt a thunderous applause as Marcus was introduced as the seller, not just as the lucky guy who found the cars, but as Marcus Rivera, premier muscle car authentication specialist and restoration consultant. His Hemmings cover story had made him a household name among collectors, and his authentication services were now booked months in advance. Behind him in the VIP section sat Frank Kowalski, Dr. Hoffman, and Wayne Carini, the people who had believed in his expertise when everyone else saw only a struggling mechanic. Richard Blackwood and Victoria Pemberton were notably absent, their predatory offers long since forgotten. Marcus had kept his promise to Uncle Eddie, retaining the Hemi Cuda convertible, while strategically selling others to establish his reputation and financial independence. Rivera Automotive Consulting now occupied a state-of-the-art facility where the old garage had stood, with a museum-quality showroom displaying the remaining collection pieces. But the real victory wasn't financial. It was the respect he'd earned through knowledge and determination, proving that expertise mattered more than circumstances. The nightmares had faded, replaced by purposeful days spent doing work that honored both his military service and his uncle's legacy. As the auction concluded, Marcus's phone buzzed with authentication requests from collectors worldwide. The boy who had once helped Uncle Eddie in the garage had become the man Eddie always knew he could be, not through luck, but through the courage to claim his own worth. Want to see more incredible barn finds and automotive discoveries? Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Muscle Car Mysteries for the latest classic car stories, restoration adventures, and hidden automotive treasures. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an epic discovery. What's the most valuable barn find you've ever heard of? Let us know in the comments below.